true story that happened. Paranormal Mount Shasta Scary Thing. After receiving a haunting text message from an unknown number that says, "Come back, they're still waiting," David and Emma decide to return to St. Augustine Hospital with a famous priest who can break the curse to complete the ritual of salvation for the trapped souls. In hopes of bringing eternal peace to the souls, the three set out, unaware that their confrontation will unleash an unprecedented fury from the other world. As the priest stepped onto the ground, the peaceful scene changed immediately. The dusk sky suddenly darkened, black clouds gathered, covering the whole sky like a curtain of death, blocking out the last light of day. The wind howled, cold and sharp as a blade, sending leaves and dust flying, as if signaling the battle between light and darkness was approaching. Emma shivered, feeling the cold air creeping up her spine, but still held on to the flashlight as a last resort. David, eyes fixed on the building, filled with confusion and apprehension, realized that every sound coming from the old hospital sounded like a distant groan. But the priest, his dark robe fluttering in the wind, walked steadily without the slightest fear. In his hand was a silver cross, the faint light from which shone like the only ray of hope in the dense darkness. Their footsteps echoed in the eerie silence, each step closer to the basement like a hammer hitting Emma and David's nerves, both held between excitement and fear. They felt invisible gazes from the dark corners of the hospital, the angry eyes of imprisoned souls following their every move. As they entered the basement, the air became even more dense, damp, and cold. The priest began to pray, his deep voice echoing, blending with the whistling wind outside like a symphony from both worlds. Suddenly, a clap of thunder boomed, and a blue light flashed through the dusty window, illuminating the mottled and crumbling walls for a moment. At that moment, David and Emma clearly felt the fear creeping into their veins, into their breaths. The light of the priest's cross seemed to be the only thing that made the darkness around them recede a little. But the feeling of being surrounded by darkness and the vengeful spirits that had never left made David almost paralyzed. Emma, trying to stay calm, but her hands were still shaking. Her eyes could not leave the priest, clinging to him as the only hope in her panic. The wind howled, cold and sharp as a blade, sending leaves and dust flying, as if signaling the battle between light and darkness was approaching. Emma shivered, feeling the cold air creeping up her spine, but still held on to the flashlight as a last resort. The sobbing and painful screams echoed from the underworld, like a dark, long, and resounding symphony, causing the surrounding air to become a solid mass, preventing any light from escaping. Suddenly, a cold wind blew from somewhere, causing the candles around the altar to flare up violently, the pale yellow light reflecting on the wall, creating strange shadows like ghosts dancing and mocking them. Darkness and light overlapped, making everything blurry, like a strange dark world that they should never enter. The priest did not retreat, continuing to raise his voice. Each word of his prayer resounded more strongly, like a sharp sword trying to pierce through the dense darkness. But at that moment, the shadows began to fight back. A savage scream suddenly rang out, full of indignation and anger, like a storm of sound tearing through the space, hitting every corner of the basement. The whole room shook, and the light from the priest's cross seemed to weaken as the darkness enveloped it. Emma and David stood beside them, their bodies frozen with fear. Emma felt a chill run down her spine, her eyes glued to the shadows moving on the wall. Each shadow carried the image of a tormented soul, a bruised body, wide eyes filled with hatred. Her hands trembling, Emma tried to suppress the scream that wanted to burst out of her throat as she saw the ghosts gradually getting closer, surrounding them. The priest, in the storm of darkness and sound, still held the cross tightly, his voice growing louder and louder, as if to suppress the screams of the souls. The light from the cross flared up, illuminating the entire basement, momentarily repelling the shadows. But not willing to give up, the souls rushed forward once more, their screams mixed with their barbaric laughter, making the atmosphere even more suffocating. In extreme fear, Emma and David clearly felt that they were being squeezed by invisible hands. Each breath became heavy. Each drop of cold sweat ran down their foreheads. The eyes of the souls were still fixed on the priest, as if wanting to destroy him, wanting to dispel the last light in this dark basement. The battle between light and darkness reached its climax, every moment filled with tension and danger. But the priest, with steadfast faith, continued to pray, his every holy word resounding like a powerful hammer blow striking the night. Finally, the light from the cross flared up once more, brighter and stronger than ever, dispelling the darkness and the angry spirits, leaving behind a space of terrifying silence. The ceremony deepened. The surrounding space seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something terrible. Then suddenly, from the cold darkness, the first ghost appeared. Its face was distorted, covered with festering wounds, black blood splattered. Its eyes were white, empty, but shining with wordless resentment, fixed on the priest. It spoke in a shrill voice, like a needle piercing every cell of all three people. "You cannot chase us away. This is our home." The voice resounded, and growls and hisses came from all directions, filled with anger and hatred, like hundreds of souls awakening. The air shook as one by one the ghosts emerged from the darkness. Their pale eyes glowed in the darkness, their flesh torn, blue-black veins crisscrossing their faces. Each ghost advanced slowly, its eyes glaring with hatred towards the priest, as if wanting to strike down anyone who dared to invade their territory. The sounds of groans, screams of pain, intertwined with the sound of hurried footsteps, filled the entire cellar with terror. The stench of blood mixed with the rising breath, pressed against Emma and David's blanket, creating a feeling of almost breathing. Emma stood straight. Her legs seemed to be nailed to the ground. A feeling of despair and fear filled every vein. Her hands were shaking. The flashlight in her hand seemed to only accentuate the horror of the spirits. David's eyes were glued to the approaching ghost. He was almost frozen. All he could hear was his heart beating wildly in his chest, helpless before what was happening. But the priest did not retreat. He raised the cross high, the light from it spreading faintly but firmly, shining in the darkness like a last ray of hope. The first ghost roared, its shrill voice turning into a hateful scream, making the space tremble. And the other ghosts roared along with it, creating a wave of angry sound, wanting to surge up, engulfing the priest and all the light from his cross. Each ghost gradually approached. They rushed in like cold winds, tearing the air. Each screamed like invisible knives stabbing into the priest's mind. The creepy sounds around them grew louder and louder, as if wanting to break all the barriers between the underworld and the living world. The priest closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and prayed loudly. Each word of his was like a flame in the night, piercing the darkness, but the light from the cross seemed to weaken as the ghosts approached. The ghosts began to surround him, their wide eyes glaring, their tattered hands reaching out, intent on tearing everything apart. The light from the cross grew weaker, as if being sucked into the dense darkness that surrounded him. Each growl, each cry, each angry footstep screeched endlessly. The space seemed to thicken, stifling and dark. Only the prayer echoed out of place in the storm of darkness. Emma and David recoiled in fear, feeling as if everything was closing in, squeezing and suffocating. They wanted to run, but they could not leave the priest, the only light in this nightmare. The darkness shrinks, swirling as if to swallow everything. The ghosts, their bodies covered with wounds and their flesh festering, slowly surrounded him, growling angrily. But the screams continued to ring in his ears. The mocking and savage laughter of the restless souls engulfed his senses. The air was thick, and those sounds were like a provocation, a response from the darkness to the priest's light. The priest stood still, cold sweat running down his forehead, but his steadfast gaze did not waver. He slowly raised the cross higher, his voice steady as he chanted each prayer with all his might. Each word he spoke was like a sharp arrow, piercing through the darkness, touching the resentment and anger of each soul. Each scream of the ghost became louder and stronger, but the priest did not retreat. Each prayer resounded like the last weapon of light, each word uttered like a blow to the deepest hatred. In that moment, the light from the cross flared up, bright, like a last ray of light piercing through the thick darkness. The ghosts screamed in anger, their screams of pain reverberating throughout the basement like echoes from the depths of hell. The light dispelled the darkness, the souls were pushed back, their faces gradually fading into the air, leaving behind a terrifyingly quiet space. David and Emma fell to their knees, exhausted, but feeling peace returning. The priest, though breathing heavily, stood tall, the cross in his hand shining brightly, like a beacon in the storm of darkness. The battle was over, and light had triumphed over the anger and hatred of the restless souls. Darkness enveloped the entire basement, forming a thick black curtain, so thick that not even a ray of light could penetrate. The light from the priest's cross gradually weakened, almost completely swallowed up. The air was suffocatingly heavy, and a feeling of terrible unease descended, as if foretelling something terrible was about to happen. Then from the depths of the darkness, a final ghost emerged. It was a female spirit, but its appearance had transformed into a terrifying monster that no longer had a human form. Her face was distorted, covered in open wounds and bleeding black blood. Her deep, empty eyes were red like two pits of hellfire. She was no longer a mere spirit, but the embodiment of boundless rage, a demon lord with deep hatred, accumulated over decades in the darkness. She was no longer a mere spirit, but the embodiment of boundless rage, a demon lord with deep hatred, accumulated over decades in the darkness. The voice was strong and deep, like a hammer hitting every corner of the basement, echoing back and forth. Immediately, the other ghosts joined in, their screams and groans blending into a deadly symphony, resounding as if wanting to tear apart reality, causing the entire space to shake violently. The priest knew that this was the decisive moment. He gathered all his strength, raised the cross high, and began to recite the prayer with the most determined and powerful voice, as if wanting to pierce the darkness and stop the hatred from the evil forces in front of him. But the light from the cross was still crushed by the overwhelming darkness of the demon lord and the ghosts, as if every word of his prayer was drowned out by their deep hatred. The demon lord rushed forward, her black hands with long, sharp claws like knives, aimed at the priest, ready to tear his body apart piece by piece. Her scream echoed into space, a roar full of anger and thirst for revenge. The entire dark space seemed to want to overflow and swallow the priest's light, pushing him back into fear and despair. The priest, sweating profusely, still held the cross tightly, his eyes shining with unshakable faith. He shouted the last verse of the Bible with all his might, The words resounded like thunder in the darkness, forming a powerful beam of light from the cross, spreading throughout the basement. That beam of light was like a sharp sword, tearing through the darkness, sweeping through the ghosts and pushing back the devil. The souls screamed in extreme pain, the sound filled with helplessness and despair. Each groan shattered, gradually disappearing into the air. The demon lord finally could not resist, screaming one last time before its monstrous form completely disappeared, blending into the night as if it had never existed. When the light from the cross was extinguished, everything fell into a state of absolute silence. The darkness retreated, returning the cellar to an eerie and terrifying silence. The thick air gradually dissipated, leaving a cold but peaceful void. The priest, sweating profusely, slowly put down the cross, his hands trembling with exhaustion, then knelt down to pray one last time, as if to offer thanks to the Almighty. David and Emma stood by, exhausted and still terrified, but they began to feel a sense of peace slowly returning. They knew that the souls who had been tormented for so many years had finally left St. Augustine Hospital, returning to hell forever, carrying with them the pain and hatred that had long been sealed away. In the silence that characterized the place that was once the realm of death, David and Emma and the priest slowly climbed the stairs to leave the basement. Each step was a release, a relief, as if they had shed a burden that had been suppressed for so long. They walked out of the hospital, stood under the night sky, and breathed in the fresh, airy air. Though still haunted by a lingering sense of dread, David and Emma felt a sense of relief, not just for the spirits who had been trapped, but for themselves. The battle with the darkness at St. Augustine Hospital was over, and they hoped that the vengeful ghosts would never return, so that the place could finally find peace. The three leave the hospital together, carrying with them the haunting memories of a life and death battle between light and darkness, and gratitude for the power of faith that helped them overcome a seemingly endless nightmare.